Hi, folks. Wanted to say a few words about this week's topic, which deals with conquest and colonization in the Atlantic world, in the Americas, and in Africa. I would say, especially in the Americas, there has been a long-term tendency to try to minimize and downplay the violent nature of what happened during the period of colonization and the expansion of frontiers westward. Part of that, I think, is a reflection of popular culture, which often lionized and admired the story of the pioneers. So all you need to do is go back and watch old movies to see that sort of theme. Even in the case of South America, there's been a tendency by the descendants of the Europeans who came and colonized to sort of bury or cover over the worst aspects of what occurred. Years ago, I was visiting in South Brazil, in the state of Rio Grande do Sul, which is right down on the border with basically Paraguay and Argentina. And the Brazilian people there, in talking about their own history, tended to sort of leave out the story of what had happened to the indigenous peoples of that region. And eventually I had a conversation with a gentleman I knew quite well, and he explained that in the Pampas region, which extends down into Argentina, that many of the indigenous people there had simply been exterminated. That was what had happened, that there were no longer native communities because they had been wiped out by people who wanted the land. And you don't need to look very far to see the same story in North America. As children, we're often brought up with the story of the Pilgrims of Plymouth having the first Thanksgiving with local Indians, and the emphasis on the peaceful relationship at the beginning of American history. But very soon in New England, you had a catastrophic war that broke out between New England tribes and the Puritans. And a little bit later down the road, the Puritans fought the Pequot War to acquire the Connecticut River Valley, which they prized. And ultimately, the Pequot Nation was largely exterminated, and many survivors sold into slavery. So there's been a real reluctance, I think, over time for people covering that history to use words like genocide or like colonialism to describe what occurred. And that has begun to shift in the historiography starting in about the past decade or so. There are now multiple works that have come out that are making these explicit connections between sort of the violent beginnings of American history and what occurs later. And there's a book by Walter Hickson from the University of Akron, and he uses the term American settler colonialism to describe what occurred, and he's drawing connections in his work between what happened in the colonial era in America and later American foreign policy in places like the Philippines, in Hawaii, in Vietnam even, to describe the historical tendency of Euro-Americans to use deadly force. So these kinds of issues have undergone a transformation in the way that people perceive them. And where I live in southeast Kansas, there's a similar kind of a change that's been taking slowly place over time. The people who live here, many of whom are descended from the original pioneers who came onto the southern plains, have really over time been fairly reluctant to own up to what happened or to look at the ethics of Indian removal. And there was an article that came out a number of years ago by a sociologist, and she interviewed people in southeast Kansas and to find out what they knew about the story of Osage removal. This is all Osage land here. And in effect, people were very defensive. They said that nothing that had happened here had been wrong, or there had been no real injustice against the Osage people. And one of the typical arguments that was used was that after all, the Osage did sign a treaty giving up their millions of acres and being removed to a reservation to the south in Indian Territory in Oklahoma. What people didn't talk about was that Osage lands were illegally overrun by settlers. And in fact, the Native Americans were really leveraged to sign over the lands, or else they were told that if you don't agree to leave now, that later you'll simply get nothing. And there were threats of violence, that the Osage might simply be overwhelmed and wiped out. So I always make the argument that this is like you agreeing to sell your house after I and my family have already moved in, and we're already, confining you to maybe the back room of the property that's yours, and telling you you should sell now for the price that we're suggesting, or else you'll simply get nothing. So we're coming up on another weekend. Next week we're going to be dealing with interesting revolutionary movements, the whole chain of dramatic revolutions, starting with the American Revolution and then following with the French, and revolutions in Haiti and other locations that transformed the modern world. And when people today think about sort of the template for what a revolution means, they're often looking back at the 18th century and what happened here in America and then in France. So have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you folks later.